From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For Keir Starmer, governing is one big balancing act. He's walking a tightrope between proving that he's willing to take tough decisions to rebuild the economy, even when they're hugely unpopular.
Perhaps you're concerned about the winter fuel allowance. I get that. As I say, if this path were popular or easy, we'd have walked it already.
But he also has to reassure supporters that this is, after all, a Labour government.
With no notice, they're going to take away the winter fuel payment. I assure you, people wouldn't have voted had that been in the manifesto. I was shocked that a Labour government would do that.
Starmer, don't be cruel!
And then he's got to convince his own MPs that cutting back on one of New Labour's proudest achievements, the winter fuel allowance, is somehow in keeping with the Labour tradition.
His mayor in Doncaster says it's wrong. Yeah. His First Minister in Wales says it's wrong. Yeah. Even his own MPs are saying it's wrong.
When the cuts to the winter fuel allowance came up again and again on the doorstep during the disastrous local elections, Keir Starmer still insisted he wouldn't budge on the policy. Until a few days ago, when he seemed to change his mind.
We want to ensure that as we go forward, more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payment.
With all the toing and froing on this policy and others, what is going on inside the Labour Party? Why does Keir Starmer keep changing his mind? Is he terrified of being beaten by reform, or is the threat closer to home?
I have no desire to go for the leadership of the Labour Party. I'm very happy and honoured to be Deputy Prime Minister of this country.
The Story today, the threat to Keir Starmer.
My name is Patrick Maguire. I'm Chief Political Commentator for The Times, and I spend most of my time, I was going to say professionally, but probably personally as well, thinking about the Labour Party and its often contradictory, ill-defined sense of itself. I've written 2 books on the Labour Party, and I think I'm no close to an answer on who exactly has full custody over the party's soul. And that's a debate that's raging in government as we speak.
Well, that's certainly something we're going to look at today, because it's hard to believe it's been barely a year since the party was elected, with a fairly landslide result, and yet the problems do seem to be piling up for Keir Starmer. Just talk us through, what are his biggest policy problems right now?
The biggest policy problems Keir Starmer has all relate to money.
We inherited a really damaged economy. We did an audit and we discovered an undisclosed £22 billion black hole this year, which we have to fix.
Remember, the first act of any minister, really, when Labour won power last July was Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, giving within weeks a big speech blaming the Conservatives for committing to spend £22 billion more than the Treasury had. And that was the context that set everything else up. It was the context that, in Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' words, would demand really tough decisions of the Labour Party. And when Rachel Reeves said that, she hoped to do 2 things. The first was to reassure the markets and bond traders. They are some of the most powerful people in British politics. But the second thing she hoped to do was win a degree of consent for some very un-Labourish decisions that she would have to take to make those sums add up. She announced she was going to cut the winter fuel allowance, one of Gordon Brown's proudest policy achievements.
I made the choice to means test the winter fuel payment so that it's only targeted at those most in need.
And embarked upon a process which is just nearing its end, a review of all government spending, which is going to see some really tricky cuts too. So I think that is the biggest problem of all. How do you make the sums add up if you're not willing to do the thing that Labour MPs would dearly wish the government would do in some respect and hike taxes to an even greater extent than they're at already?
And in terms of those policy decisions, the things you have to do to try and make the budget add up, you mentioned winter fuel allowance. Just describe how that's gone down on the doorstep, how unpopular it's proved to be.
I think when Rachel Reeves announced that policy last year, there was a belief in her team, her political team in the Treasury, that she would be commended for doing something difficult and that ultimately people would appreciate that extremely rich pensioners, Paul McCartney and Richard Branson's are often examples given, that she would be commended for taking a tough decision. It actually turns out that, as several governments have learnt to their cost, pensioners are a very effective lobby in British politics. There's an awful lot of them, and people don't like having their money that they feel they've earned taken away from them. And to say it's been unpopular would be somehow understating it. On every doorstep any Labour canvasser, MP or minister has knocked on in recent months, they will all tell you that each one of those doors is almost certainly opening with a complaint about the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance.
The things that struck me, colleagues that went to campaign in Runcorn, that was the issue raised on every doorstep. Some things cut through. You remember Mrs Thatcher and the poll tax? It just cut through. And I think the winter fuel is like that, because everybody knows an old person, people think of old people as a vulnerable group. For the money that Rachel got out of it, it wasn't worth it.
Nigel Farage and Sarah Poaching, the new Reform MP for Runcorn, put their success in the local elections and that parliamentary by-election on Merseyside down to anger with the winter fuel allowance. So it's not only been unpopular, it's done something very dangerous for the Labour Party, which is it's already motivated hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to vote against the government. That is a dangerous place for any government to be, and it's a less than ideal place to start thinking about a U-turn from.
How much of this, though, is down to Starmer's own style? I mean, would a stronger leader have been able to convince people that the winter fuel allowance perhaps had had its day?
There was some at the time who said, look, we've got this completely the wrong way round. Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer kept getting up and saying, this is a really tough decision. We don't want to be doing this. It's awful. But it was never couched in positive terms. It was never what we want to do in an era of scarce resources is to allocate them to the people who need it most. So that's why we're taking the decision to withdraw winter fuel allowance from the better off pensioners. I think if you look at the polling, if you look at the sum of money involved, 1.5 billion, yes, it's a lot of money, but in the context of all government spending, it's not a huge amount of money. They were always going to be on a hiding to nothing in hindsight. And there is a sense that it wasn't necessarily a case of strength. It was a case of almost being too strong, or almost putting too much store in the idea that they had to be strong, they had to be tough, they had to almost be performatively cruel in what they were doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taken seriously. When actually what had happened was people had voted in the Labour government and almost expected them to act like a conventional Labour government. It becomes weirdly existential for the Labour Party if you get into these questions. In a way, it isn't for the Conservative Party or indeed Reform or any other party of the right. So certainly Keir Starmer could have explained the winter fuel policy better. I don't necessarily think it would have made all the difference, though, just because it's so unpopular on its own merit.
And one of the other issues that gets mentioned a lot in terms of trying to make the sums add up, but is causing all sorts of ructions within the Labour Party, is the child benefit cap. Just tell us what's happening there what the argument is within Labour and why it feels like such a totemic policy for the Labour Party.
The two-child benefit cap is a George Osborne, David Cameron era policy. It does what it says on the tin, limits the receipt of child benefit and other related benefits to the first two children in any family. It was hugely controversial when it was introduced, and repealing it became a sort of staple demand of the Labour left under Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, he was loud and proud in demanding it was withdrawn. Keir Starmer in 2023, almost by accident, made this a red line for his own leadership when he was asked by the BBC, you talk endlessly about tough decisions, what does that actually mean? Would you, for instance, keep the hated two-child benefit cap? And Keir Starmer hadn't really thought of it before. There'd been no prior discussion about it, but he just said yes.
If you have more than two children at the moment, you don't get benefits. Would that change under a Labour government?
We're not changing that policy.
You're not changing the two-child policy of benefits?
He almost accidentally said yes, and that caused a huge row in the Labour Party. It was consistent with the approach Keir Starmer had taken to date, which was, don't come out and just parrot whatever the rest of the Labour Party would like you to say. You've got to show rather than just tell that you are willing to put the national interest, as his advisors would put it, and fiscal stability first. So he did that. It caused a massive row. Then fast forward to July 2024, Keir Starmer is getting into government, and the left of the Labour Party, people like John McDonnell and other members of the Socialist Campaign Group of Corbynite backbenchers, they amended the King's Speech to demand an end to the two-child benefit cap. 7 of them duly voted for it, 7 of them were duly suspended. Now, that's not to say there aren't many, many more, if not a majority, if not a supermajority of Labour MPs who actually agreed with them. But there was a feeling last year in July that it was too early to pick such a big symbolic fight with the government. Now we're almost another year on, the pendulum has swung again, which is to say there are lots of Labour MPs who think, well, hang on, we've spent a year talking about spending cuts, we've spent a year talking tough, some would say parroting the right on immigration, we've cut the winter fuel allowance, all the public wants to do is complain, we're polling terribly. Nigel Farage, of all people, is coming out and saying, I'd lift the two-child benefit cap, so are Tories on the right of British politics. Why don't we do it? This is what we are for as a party. And so really that sort of suppressed unease, discomfort, whatever you want to call it, has burst out into the open in the wake of Labour's terrible showing in the local elections. And it feels like MPs finally think we have permission to talk about this.
And it's interesting, as you described, this was a policy that effectively Keir Starmer made on the hop without really having thought it through. It does sort of crystallise some of the problems he faces, though. As you say, for a lot of people within the party, it does make them wonder what the Labour Party is for. This is the party of Beveridge and Attlee. Just explain why child poverty in particular is something that a lot of people will feel cuts to the soul of what Labour should stand for.
Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? If you have a party that is devoted to, the redistribution of wealth, the improvement of the lives of the least fortunate in society, it's difficult to imagine a more slam dunk case for your existence than the eradication of child poverty. Gordon Brown, if you were to sit him down and say, sum up your moral mission in a sentence, the words eradication, child and poverty would be load-bearing words in that sentence.
It's interesting to see he's decided to stick his head above the parapet with a podcast appearance himself.
70% of the children in poverty are in working families. When it comes to the two-child rule, 60% of children who are being affected by the two-child rule are in families where someone is working. Most of the rest of the families are actually people where temporary redundancy, illness or disability in the family, mothers who can't actually afford to work because they can't afford the childcare. These are all problems that the government is trying to solve.
The week this debate was raging, he called for new taxes to fund the abolition of the two-child cap, which definitely isn't yet the line from within the Labour Party. But there is a long, long history of this being the issue for sections of the Labour Party, for leaders of the Labour Party. You know, Harold Wilson talking about the Labour Party as a moral crusade or being nothing. You know, the vast body of literature by people like Frank Field, the late Maverick MP who founded the Child Poverty Action Group in the 1960s, said there is lots of history that is very, very difficult for Keir Starmer or anybody else to stand in front of and say, no, not now, because it's the very point of the Labour Party.
How much is the party starting to blame him?
Criticism of Keir Starmer has always been surprisingly easy to find. But the person or the people who are actually getting most of the heat over this are, yes, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, but it's people around the Prime Minister. You know, there are briefings to the newspapers suggesting the Prime Minister really wants to do this. OK, but why isn't he doing this? Well, it's because his aides, like his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, don't want him to do it. Most of Keir Starmer's close political aides in Downing Street are from the right of the Labour Party, so there's almost a sense that these people are alien to the Labour tradition. You know, people saying that somehow this isn't a true Labour government, which is quite the place for a government that won a majority of 170 seats only 10 months ago.
Patrick, so much has happened since then. We've had catastrophic results, really, at the local elections. We've had by-elections going wrong for Labour. Into that huge maelstrom of problems swirling around Downing Street enters Angela Rayner. People have accused her of being on manoeuvres. Just tell us what she's been up to.
Well, Angela Rayner has, I think it's fair to say, been playing what people in Westminster call a cute game, just as Labour was having its collective nervous breakdown over winter fuel and the two-child benefit cap and its electoral position. A memo makes its way to the front page of the Daily Telegraph, and it reveals that Angela Rayner told Rachel Reeves, look, here are a range of tax rises you can introduce that don't break our manifesto pledge not to raise taxes on working people, that Rachel Reeves ignored those proposals, but whoever leaked it to the Daily Telegraph, and Angela Rayner insists it wasn't her team insist it wasn't them.
I do not leak. I think leaks are very damaging. I'm 100% behind our cabinet and the decisions that we make collectively.
But whoever did it has done Angela Rayner a bit of a favour, really, because it reminds Labour MPs, it reminds the Labour members that here is a senior member of the cabinet, a senior member of the leadership of the Labour Party who hasn't lost touch with what you want to do. She's willing to talk about raising taxes when Rachel Reeves is warning with a grim face of spending cuts.
And as you say, when a lot of people are pointing to the people around Keir Starmer and blaming them for being too right-wing, it does set up an alternative plan within Labour. How has that gone down within the party?
She is seen as the hot favourite. She's really the only show in town for the next leadership race at present. You know, she has done her credentials with Labour MPs, members and trade unions no harm. And it's added to that sense of inevitability. On the flip side, it's never great to be seen to be manoeuvring too brazenly for these things. It doesn't exactly sow trust between the Prime Minister and his deputy and Number 10 and her team. But, you know, it's done her no harm. And, you know, you speak to Labour MPs about the succession and they're either enthusiastic about Angela Rayner or resigned to Angela Rayner being the next leader of the Labour Party.
Wow, it's as certain as that. And in the meantime, whether it's those internal pressures within the party or whether it's some of the external ones, which we'll come on to in a moment, Keir Starmer, a man who's made it clear that he wouldn't be changing his policy on popular issues like the winter fuel allowance, has found himself cornered into making a U-turn.
We want to ensure that as we go forward, more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payment. As you would expect, Mr. Speaker, we will only make decisions we can afford. That is why we will look at that as part of a fiscal event.
That happened very quickly. It was opposed by several people in Number 10, including his directors of communications and policy, and it's proving very difficult to communicate because how do you say something is such a tough and integral decision that you absolutely have to do it one day, and the next, okay, it's tough, but it turns out to be too tough, so we won't do that one now. The fact that he has U-turned is a sign, and it's a reminder, I think, that everything is now up for grabs in terms of this Downing Street's political strategy in a way it just wasn't before the local elections.
And the timing is interesting, isn't it? It's obviously after the local elections, as you say, where we saw winter fuel allowance being incredibly unpopular. We saw other parties benefiting because of it. And it's just before the spending review, which really is crunch time for all of those difficult decisions. In order to make this work, will he have to tear up some of his other promises?
Look, that's the risk, that, yes, okay, you can alleviate short-term political or internal pain by saying, OK, we will spend a bit more on the winter fuel allowance. We will lift the two-child cap. Before you know it, you're spending upwards of £5 billion. An already difficult spending review becomes even more difficult as the Treasury says, you need to find something else to cut, to which angry cabinet ministers are already saying there isn't anything left to cut if you want a functioning state. Or that crucial manifesto pledge on taxes is going to have to be looked at again. And if it remains sacrosanct, then they're going to have to tax something else. Is it going to be property? Is it going to be wealth? Is it going to be business? Solving one political problem could well create another.
Patrick, after the local elections and many of the polls that have followed, it's become very clear that one of the big problems for Keir Starmer is reform and Nigel Farage snapping at his heels. But as you've already pointed out, part of the problem was also within his own party. Just talk us through the different factions within Labour at the moment, what they represent and how they're playing up.
I keep saying, it's remarkable that within the space of a year, for the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, those 411 odd MPs, to be fragmenting in the way that they are is pretty remarkable. You have the Hardy Perennials, you have the Corbynite Socialist Campaign Group, who, under Starmer in opposition were pretty irrelevant. They've been marginalised, they've been variously kicked out, suspended, deselected from the party, but now they are back speaking with a sort of moral authority. They've managed to reposition themselves sort of as the moral conscience of the Labour Party, which is pretty remarkable.
I am a Labour Party member, but I believe in Labour Party values. And the problem that Keir has at this point is a lot of MPs, but also Labour voters, people who have voted for Labour year in, year out, are a bit worried that Keir is moving away from Labour values.
You've also got Blue Labour, who, advocate for, bluntly, a right-wing position on immigration and culture and a left-wing position on economics. Now, the right-wing position on immigration is helpful for the Labour leadership in Downing Street because that's what they're trying to do. But you're also hearing an increasingly assertive criticism from them on, the approach to the welfare state, on nationalisation, etc., etc. Similarly, from the Red Wall group of Labour MPs who are saying Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules are a nightmare for seats like theirs. The seats that were won by Boris Johnson from Labour in 2019, won back in 2024. Britain's Rust Belt, the coalfield towns, the post-industrial areas of the North and the Midlands. And you also have the growth group of Labour MPs who, again, ironically, a caucus of new Labour MPs that set itself up to support the government. But even they're getting pretty agitated. They're saying, we need a new approach to investment. We need a new approach to the fiscal rules. Otherwise, this is a government that's going to struggle to achieve growth. It's obsessed with making the sums add up, the finer points of accounting. So already you have this sort of very vociferous parliamentary party with all of these groups trying to fill the vacuum and shape the agenda, when the more conventional thing, if you're a prime minister who's just won a majority, is to tell those people, shut up, I'm in charge.
Patrick, one of the reasons Labour has had to change its stance on many things has been the threat of reform. We know that they're a huge challenge to the Tory party, but they also seem to be a huge, potentially existential challenge to Labour. Just explain why and how we've seen that playing out.
The most obvious answer to the why is that they are winning in a lot of Labour seats, and they won control of councils like County Durham, which had been Labour since its foundation in the 1920s.
I said We've dealt with the Conservative Party, although to be fair, they pretty much dealt with themselves, I think, prior to the election. And I said very clearly, now we're coming for Labour.
And it's often thought that reform is primarily a threat to the Conservative Party, and electorally that is sort of true. You know, they are cannibalising the Tory vote and sort of replacing them as the party on the right of British politics. The problem for Labour is that Nigel Farage is moving left on economics, and he's calling for nationalisation of key industries. He's calling for an end to the two-child cap.
And that is why we believe lifting the two-child cap is the right thing to do. Not because we support a benefits culture, but because we believe for lower paid workers, this actually makes having children just a little bit easier.
He's calling for the winter fuel allowance to be reinstated in full.
We also recognise those that have worked during their lives, saved for a private pension, are now penalised by the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance.
People will be surprised by this because they associate Nigel Farage with a sort of certain kind of free market, Thatcherite, pinstripe Toryism. But every other successful party of the radical right in Europe always has a strong leftist, redistributive message on welfare because that's where their voters are, that's who their voters are. And that is the direction Nigel Farage is going to be moving in. You know, there's always been a massive expanse of space in British politics for a party that, in the Blue Labour formula, you know, talks right and thinks right on questions of culture, borders, law and order, and tilts left on economics. And given that Keir Starmer is only doing one half of that, for Nigel Farage to fill the vacuum at a time when he's already leading in the polls, when he's winning Labour seats anyway, I would suggest is pretty dangerous.
Is there a chance that an Angela Rayner version of Labour would actually pose a bigger challenge to reform than what Labour is putting out at the moment? I mean, is there a gap there? Is that a way Labour could take on the reform challenge?
Of course there's a gap, because that's the space Nigel Farage is filling. You know, take that away from Nigel Farage and show that an incumbent government is doing it, and you blunt that attack from Nigel Farage. The difficulty Labour will have, of course, which Farage doesn't have now and won't have until an election campaign in 2029, is making the sums add up. So, look, I think there is an awareness in Number 10, and people who think that this is the new direction of travel for British politics are sort of winning the argument. The issue, as ever, will be whether Rachel Reeves can, one, make the sums add up, and also whether they can finesse this politically. And the big question, of course, on the two-child benefit cap is whether the public will thank them in the same way they will for you turning on the winter fuel allowance.
And beyond the economics, you know, one of the criticisms of Starmer is his leadership style. Is there something about Angela Rayner which is sort of more in the mould of Boris Johnson, really? It's the Heineken model of politics, I suppose. She does reach the parts that other politicians don't. Would she be a real threat to Farage?
I think there's an awareness that it will be a great show, Nigel versus Angela. It will be pure politics. They are both very political people, accomplished campaigners. They shoot from the hip. They speak directly. They are not cut from the conventional political cloth. So it would certainly be an exciting campaign. And there is that idea that Angela Rayner is the only person who can probably match Farage in debate and tear chunks out of him as he'll tear chunks out of her, might well be something that seduces Labour MPs in the years to come.
In the meantime, for people who are looking at Keir Starmer and wondering whether he'll last, it is hard within the Labour Party to replace a leader, isn't it? Just talk us through what it would take for a serious challenge from Angela Rayner to be made.
Firstly, I don't think it's going to happen. But say it did, she would need 20% of Labour MPs, which is now 80 of them, and nominations from 3 trade unions to win. Now, if Keir Starmer is replaced mid-term, I don't think it's going to be that way. I think it will be a de facto coronation, and there'll be one candidate and he'll have to agree to resign.
Despite all of that, given how unpopular his leadership style is, if you're a betting man, would you think he would be leading the party into the next election?
I'm not sure I get particularly good odds, but I still think I'd be odds on at this point, narrowly.
Really?
Yeah. So, look, I just think it's too difficult to get rid of a Labour leader midstream, even if it looks like they're a complete dud. Labour MPs don't often have the stomach for it. Maybe political culture has changed, but I just think, barring further disaster, while the odds have narrowed on Keir Starmer fighting the next election, I do think it's still likely than not.
That was Patrick Maguire, chief political commentator at The Times, and the author of 2 books that chart Labour in the Corbyn and Starmer era, Left Out and Get In. You can get both of those from the Times bookshop online. The producer today was Shabnam Grewal, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Malasetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.